Hello, I'm Sugan Kim from Next Group. Next Group is a nonprofit energy and climate policy think tank aiming for a net zero transition in Asia. We conduct research and propose energy and climate policy options to achieve carbon neutrality. Today, I will be presenting based on the recently published report, Net Zero Roadmap for the Korean Petrochemical Industry. So far, discussions on the petrochemical industry have focused on plastic consumptions and demand. Next group has conducted research from the supply side perspective, proposing emission reductions at the production stage. These are our contents. After providing a brief overview of the current status of the Korean petrochemical industry, I will present the key decarbonization strategies and the emission modeling conducted by the next group. Based on our analysis, I will discuss the policy recommendations and industry implications derived from our findings. First, I'll share some key facts about the Korean petrochemical industry. Well, you might not know this, but South Korea is a major player in the petrochemical industry. It's the first largest producer of ethylene, right behind China, US, and Saudi Arabia. Well, since South Korea has a relatively small population, its manufacturing sector heavily relies on exports, and the petrochemical industry is no different. As you can see, around half of its revenue comes from exports. In 2023 alone, South Korea exported petrochemical products worth $45.7 billion. And even so, exports to China have decreased recently. China is still the biggest market for South Korean petrochemicals, with a lot of exports also going to places like US, Japan, Vietnam, and India. And naphtha and LPG are the main feedstocks of Korea's chemical industry. While Europe and China produce ammonia and methanol using natural gas and coal as their feedstocks. The first step of chemical manufacturing in South Korea is importing crude oil from Middle East. And after that, naphtha is produced in the oil refining industry. With naphtha, the basic chemical like ethylene, propylene, and butadiene is produced. After that process, the resins that is used to make plastic is created through various chemical reactions. The final products of petrochemical industry are plastics, rubbers, and synthetic fibers. Now, I will explain the rationale for the petrochemical industry's low carbon transition. Well, first up, given how big the petrochemical industry is in Korea, it's crucial to find a way to transition while keeping it strong. In 2022, the chemical industry made up 8% of Korea's total emissions, hitting 49.2 million tons. And in the same year, the industry's production was worth about 135 trillion Korean won, which is $91.8 billion. This makes up more than 6% of the country's total manufacturing output. So, in short, cutting emissions from the petrochemical industry is key for South Korea to meet its Paris Agreement goals. But since the industry plays such a big role in the economy, the transition needs to be smart and well planned. Looking at the petrochemical industries in Northeast Asia, the sector grew in stages, first in Japan, then South Korea, and later in China. Well, Japan's industry started shrinking early on, while China is still growing fast to keep up with its domestic demand. And since Japan's petrochemical sector is relatively small, there's not much pressure for big changes. And because China still isn't fully self-sufficient, it doesn't feel the need to take the lead in decarbonization just yet. But South Korea is in a different position. It's at a turning point where it needs to work hard to stay competitive. And out of these three countries, South Korea has the strongest need for transformation in its petrochemical industry. Up until a few years ago, South Korea's focus on basic petrochemical products wasn't a big issue. But as China rapidly expanded its petrochemical industry with strong government support, weakness in South Korea's sector started to show. And now China is heavily investing in everything from basic feedstocks to high-value specialty products. And over the past 3 years, South Korean petrochemical companies have been struggling with losses. So to stay competitive, South Korea needs to diversify its export markets beyond China. So now the industry is at a turning point and structural transformation is no longer optional, it's a must. The decarbonization trend in the petrochemical industry and the transition in plastics present a significant opportunity for South Korea. Europe's CBAM, as its full implementation is set for 2026, there is a high likelihood that the petrochemical industry will be included in the scope of regulation. And the Global Plastic Treaty, once finalized and implemented by individual countries this year, also will drive a worldwide transformation of the petrochemical industry. If South Korea achieves decarbonization ahead of its competitors, it will regain a competitive edge in the global petrochemical market. So now I will explain how petrochemical industry can achieve decarbonization. Let me start by breaking down how South Korea's petrochemical industry emits greenhouse gases. The industry produces key feedstocks like ethylene, propylene, and butadiene from naphtha. This happens through a process called thermal cracking in the naphtha cracking center, and it is the biggest source of emissions in petrochemical production. The image below is the whole process of the cracker. During the pyrolysis of naphtha, LNG and byproduct methane from naphtha cracking are used as the main fuel sources, making up about 70% of Scope 1 emissions. And the rest, around 30%, comes from generating the steam and electricity needed for other chemical reactions. And since petrochemical complexes use a huge amount of electricity, they also produce a lot of indirect emissions, the Scope 2 emissions. So even though the chemical industry operates with a complex process structure, the emissions data is clear. Cutting emissions from cracker operations is the key to decarbonizing this sector. Now, this is the overview of our net zero strategies. A structural reform of the Korean petrochemical industry must proceed to reduce the number of crackers. And strategies for fuel substitution, low material substitution, and plastic recycling must be implemented simultaneously. The first step of the transformation is restructuring the basic petrochemicals. The production of basic feedstocks, which accounts for a significant portion of emissions, has also contributed to the underperformance of the Korea petrochemical industry. As you can see, too many companies in Korea are focused on base chemicals. Therefore, by integrating crackers between companies, it is possible to eliminate the operating losses and reduce emissions. The key to decarbonizing the petrochemical industry is switching crackle fuels to electricity and hydrogen. And to do this, we suggest e-furnaces and methane pyrolysis for hydrogen production. First, e-furnace is electric heating for crackers. E-furnaces replace traditional fuels like byproduct methane and LNG with electricity. By switching to electric heating powered by renewable energy, carbon emissions can be reduced by 90 to 95%. BSF, in partnership with Savik and Linde, has been working on this technology and started operating a demo e-furnace last year, testing both indirect and direct heating methods. However, replacing a typical cracker furnace with the electric version would require about 730 megawatt of electricity, so making the full transition will take time. And despite these challenges, electric heating is one of the most effective decarbonization solutions for the petrochemical industry. In South Korea, the government is leading a R&D project with LG Chem to develop electric heating technology for crackers. The image on the right is methane pyrolysis. Methane pyrolysis is hydrogen production without CO2. Methane pyrolysis takes the byproduct methane from cracker and converts it into hydrogen, which is then reused as fuel in the cracker process. This process splits methane into hydrogen and solid carbon black, meaning no CO2 is emitted. And in the long run, the petrochemical industry needs to shift from fossil fuel-based feedstocks to bio-based alternatives. Bio-naphtha, biomethanol, and e-methanol are the examples, and the image below shows how biomethanol and e-methanol are synthesized. But just like crude oil, South Korea will have to rely on imports for biomass and green hydrogen. This means bio-based feedstocks aren't a quick fix for decarbonization. For example, when discussing the 2030 NDC targets in Korea, bio-naphtha was considered the key decarbonization strategy in petrochemical sector. However, after reassessing the supply outlook, the government concluded that South Korea would not be able to import sufficient amount by 2030. Therefore, government had to adjust the Korea industry's 2030 emissions targets. And this series of events also led next year to present its clean feedstock strategy with some caution. But on the bright side, now the government is actively driving clean methanol development with a clean methanol plant set to open in Gangwon province by 2027. And of course, along with decarbonizing the production, reducing virgin plastic production through recycling is just as important. Plastic is, after all, the final product of the petrochemical industry. Next group has a 2030 plastic recycling target of 35% mechanical recycling and 5% chemical recycling. For reference, the material recycling rate in 2021 was only 16%. Mechanical recycling means crushing plastics into flakes that can be reused as raw materials. It mainly works for PET, HDPE, and PP. Chemical recycling, on the other hand, breaks down plastics at the molecular level to create basic petrochemical feedstocks. The process is more complex, but the product quality is higher. Now, Korean petrochemical companies are focusing more on chemical recycling, especially waste vinyl pyrolysis. By 2026, the country's annual production capacity for pyrolysis oil is expected to reach 300,000 tons, making it one of the largest in the world. So this is petrochemical. So the petrochemical companies find it difficult to enter the existing recycling market and consider chemical recycling to have higher added value. So both the government and industry see chemical recycling as a key solution. Now, I will present the emission reduction pathway of the petrochemical industry with the decarbonization technologies I have just explained. This page shows the timeline of the net zero roadmap in our report. Steps 1 to 3 represent fuel substitution strategies. Step 4 to 6 outline low material substitution strategies, and the final step, number 7, is the carbon capture strategy. Well, looking at the visualization on the right, by 2050, 3 out of the 10 crackers currently operating in South Korea are expected to shut down. Of the remaining 7, 5 will be integrated with methane pyrolysis processes, and the other 2 will be converted to e-furnaces. Alternative feedstocks like bio-naphtha and pyrolysis naphtha will become more common by 2050, and will be processed in the updated crackers. The remaining carbon emissions will be captured by CCUS technology in 2050. This is our final emission reduction pathway graph, and this pathway aligns with our internally calculated carbon budget. By 2030, it is expected that emissions reductions will occur due to production volume reductions and the downsizing of the crackers. And from 2030, decarbonization technologies will be fully introduced, and emission reductions driven by those technologies are expected to take place. And after 2040, large-scale commercialization of alternative feedstocks and the maturity of CCUS technology will lead to continuous emission reductions. This page is a chart that simplifies our roadmap for easier understanding. You can see the emission reductions by each strategy up until 2050. It shows that the fuel substitution effect is the largest, followed by CCUS, production volume reduction, and biomnaphtha. However, even with significant emission reductions by 2050, the petrochemical industry will still have net positive emissions. Nevertheless, if a system for producing alternative feedstock is set up and their production continues to grow after 2050, the industry is expected to reach net zero emissions. The last part is the policy recommendations and industry implications derived from our analysis. The structural transformation of the petrochemical industry needs to go hand in hand with regional transition. Specifically, the Yeosu Petrochemical Complex in Korea, which has many companies focused on basic feedstock production, is facing concerns about a potential regional collapse. In response, the government is considering designating the area as an industrial crisis preemptive response zone, which would provide tax benefits, financial support, and health training programs. However, the current Regional Industry Crisis Response Act mainly supports small and medium-sized companies, and there's a need to pay more attention to the transition strategies for large companies. Next group plans to carry out follow-up research on transition strategies for its petrochemical complex this year. Now, these are the current developments in decarbonization technologies for Korea's petrochemical industry. The focus is on replacing the cracker's pyrolysis process, with LG Chem serving as the lead research institution. And regarding alternative feedstock, discussions are underway to utilize the byproduct methane after the introduction of the furnace. Well, despite these technological advances, there hasn't been a clear plan for supporting key decarbonization technologies. Technologies like e-furnaces, heat pumps, and methane pyrolysis require large investments, but Korean government hasn't yet committed to supporting these initiatives. For example, BASF, the German company, the world's largest petrochemical company, has received government support in Germany for its technologies. Specifically, heat pump technology was chosen for the CCFD program, which helped ensure stable operations. CCFD, Carbon Contracts for Difference, is a financial tool that supports low carbon technologies by guaranteeing a fixed carbon price. And this makes investment in decarbonization technologies more attractive and predictable for companies. And this is at the suggestion of the next group, the Korean Ministry of Environment has been considering introducing CCFD in Korea since last year. However, there has been no official plan yet, so we will continue to monitor the progress of the CCFD implementation. Lastly, I will share our outreach activities and the conclusion of this presentation. Next group conducted outreach events with the National Assembly and the Ministry of Environment last year. At the 2035 At the 2035 NDC implementation seminar, we argued more ambitious emission targets for the petrochemical sector. And during the National Assembly Forum, we emphasized the need and importance of decarbonization investments for petrochemical complexes under pressure to transition. We will continue to monitor the 2035 NDC and petrochemical industry policies this year to provide feedback. The petrochemical industry accounts for 3% of global CO2 emissions and 18% of total industrial CO2 emissions. But until now, international attention has focused on the consumption and disposal of plastics. So now it is time to shift the spotlight to the upstream. The key decarbonization technologies have high production costs and it made corporate commitment low so far. Therefore, to create green petrochemical market, government must create mandatory demands through regulatory measures to incentivize corporate production. So I hope everyone here can help build an enabling environment by supporting green demand, regulating petrochemical emissions, and making decarbonization technologies more affordable. Petrochemical decarbonization needs more attention. And well, that's all for my presentation. Thanks so much for listening. Please leave your questions on the chat.